Good morning, students. It's Tuesday, March 24th, and I'm happy to be back with you this morning. I'm going to make this really quick today. Really, mostly what I want you to do is take just a couple slides of notes from your concept outline, and then read an article posted on Haiku on Russia and Afghanistan. It is an interesting look on the way the United States was involved even back in the late 70s in Afghanistan. So just a heads up, I'm thinking on probably Thursday. Today's Tuesday. Yeah, I'm thinking on probably Thursday we're going to have a quiz. Now these quizzes are going to be a little different, but it'll essentially be an open note quiz. So I'm going to be posting a quiz on Thursday coming up on the concept outline up to this point. So, like I said, we're still rolling right along and getting things done because we have, curriculum to get through as well, even though the AP board is not going to be testing you on the period 8 and period 9 chapters or units. Okay, so let's move on. You hopefully have read in your book about the voices of Vietnam. We are going to talk more about especially the Tet Offensive and Vietnam here and there. There's a really great book that if you want to read it, it's called The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. Tim O'Brien is actually an author from Minnesota, and it's based on his life, not completely based on his life, but it's a very, very interesting book, and I highly recommend if you want to read it. We will, however, talk a little bit more here and there about Vietnam. As you can tell, we are really jumping around here in the time frame, but because it's all about a theme here. So the next part, the Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct and indirect military confrontations and periods of mutual coexistence, or détente. Détente's a good word to know. Obviously, mutual coexistence, you know what that word means. You can see in that picture over on the left, it's Khrushchev's visit to the United States in 1959. It was a weird time. Khrushchev now is the president or premier of the USSR. He came over. It was very hopeful to kind of achieve some peace between the United States and the USSR. It was a rather strained visit, partly because if you know anything about Khrushchev, the guy was a little wacky. He came over to the United States. He had a meeting with the president. He wanted to go to Disneyland, and at that time only Disneyland, I think, was created, and that's in California. Well, he flies all the way to California to find out that Disneyland was closed, or for some reason he couldn't get into Disneyland. Something had happened, and he is absolutely fit to be tied that he can't go to Disneyland. So rather than coming back and having like one more kind of wrap-up meeting with the president, Eisenhower, he gets mad and storms off and goes all the way back to Russia, all the way back to the USSR. And so it does ultimately end in goodwill, but Khrushchev he's a hot ticket, and nobody really understands really how to handle him. Part of the issue was the U-2 incident. Gary Powers was his name. A U-2 was shot down by the USSR, and that's confrontation. That is a period of direct confrontation. We are very upset about this. Then there's other times that there's more, mutual coexistence. So the Berlin Wall, we've already kind of spoken about that. The Berlin Wall is put up, and this permanently separates East Berlin and West Berlin, and really the East and the West. And this is what Churchill is really calling the Iron Curtain. And now there is a physical wall there. I remember very well, I was just a kid, but when the Berlin Wall came down, it was huge. I mean, it was a party like I couldn't even probably fathom. because people had lived under that oppression on the other side of the wall for a very, very long time. The Cuban Missile Crisis, I'm going to just kind of skip over that one because we will talk about that one some more tomorrow. But the Cuban Missile Crisis was a very tense 13-day period. In fact, I think there's a movie called 13 Days. It's a good one. This is under JFK's administration. Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the White House put in a hotline with the USSR, literally a phone that connected straight to the Kremlin in the USSR to prevent another Cuban Missile Crisis, because it was so close to resulting in a nuclear war. So then a nuclear test ban treaty is put into place that really just prohibited test detonations, partly because of the fear of radioactivity being kind of material being sent into the atmosphere, into the world. So that word détente then. Détente is this easing of hostilities to help strained relationships of you didn't want to get into direct military confrontation. Partly the reason that détente improved was because China and the USSR's relationship was very strong, and then they split. And so when the United States knew that the two strongest communist nations were no longer friends, we felt a little bit more secure. We felt like we could take a breather. If they're not friends and going to gang up on us, okay, maybe we can handle this then. And so I would say the détente, the coexistence was much better after the USSR and China split. And when that happens, Nixon makes a visit to China, and this is a big deal. I mean, Nixon is really only remembered for being, your president is not a crook. He was a crook. But don't forget about the fact that Nixon went to China. Nobody went to China. No president had ever been to China. This was a big deal. So Nixon's visit to China was very strategic, it was very diplomatic, and it was to open trade, and it did. Now, unfortunately, Nixon also made a grain deal with the USSR. Some people consider Nixon's grain deal with the USSR to be his economic Bay of Pigs. An absolute disaster. The United States, through Nixon, made a grain deal with the USSR, and essentially the USSR had gone through a period of drought, and they lost a lot of crops, grain crops especially. So they bought U.S. grain. Well, they bought a huge amount. They kind of like locked in a good price, but they bought more than we really understood, and they did it kind of on the sly. So they did it all kind of at the same time with different grain buyers, but like one grain buyer didn't know the USSR was buying from another grain buyer as well. Cargill actually happened to be the largest one. Well, they ended up buying about 25% of the United States grain, and they bought it at a really great price. And then we didn't have enough grain to feed our own people. So the price of grain the price of grain went up, and so it made all of our commodities go up. It was a pretty shady deal. We look at this kind of like the great grain robbery instead of the great train robbery. During all of this, Vietnam is happening. And Nixon is coming in toward the end of Vietnam, and he wants to have what's called the Vietnamization. And Vietnamization is essentially giving back Vietnam to the Vietnam people and letting them defend themselves. This is what the hope is. Now, we we see that when we transfer the power and we see South Vietnam fall and the fall of Saigon, it was a very sad time in both the South Vietnam history and probably American history as well. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. This is SALT 1. We'll see SALT 2. It started with Johnson. Nixon is the one who finally signs it. They come to an agreement with the USSR to limit nuclear weapons. This is an agreement that had been in place, and then we will hear it again when we get to more recent events like Iran. Not so much Iraq, but Iran and India, Pakistan, Korea, North Korea, some of those instances. So, post-war decolonization and the emergence of powerful nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East led both sides in the Cold War to seek alliances among new nations, many of which remained non-aligned. So, in 1948, the United States recognized Israel. Israel became a country after the British Mandate of Palestine. Holocaust survivors had no place to go. They weren't going to go back to their homes. There was nothing left of them. The memories of what had happened were seared into their mind. They didn't have a home, and Israel had always been God's chosen land for his people. And so the U.S. recognized Israel as a state for especially Holocaust survivors, Jewish people who wanted to go back to their homeland. While it created a very tense, unstable relationship between not only Muslims and Jews, but because we recognized Israel, between Israel and Palestine and really the Mideast. And it's what started to spark the tension in the Middle East. Operation Ajax in Iran. This is all about oil. The CIA overthrew the Democratic, and believe me, I use that word lightly, the Democratic leader to replace him with the Shah. And it was essentially to get our hands on oil, not probably a wise political move on our part, but it was very much an economic move. The Peace Corps was established mostly to promote world peace, help improve other countries' infrastructure. This is kind of JFK's baby, if you will. It promoted voluntary service. In fact, if you go, I was going to embed a YouTube video, but if you go over to YouTube and find a commercial, boy, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I remember watching commercials about the Peace Corps, and their slogan was "the toughest job you'll ever love." And usually it's young people. Typically they're educated, college educated, or maybe not even, but young people who probably don't have families, although their families are not excluded from becoming part of the Peace Corps. And they'll go to an impoverished country. They'll build things. They'll do healthcare. They'll do education. My best friend's daughter was wanting to go into the Peace Corps. Fortunately, she couldn't because she has here we go. I can't remember. She has a condition where she needs to take medication daily for it. She has seizures. She has epilepsy. That's it. She has epilepsy. It's controlled with medication, but if she's in a remote area, chances are she wouldn't be able to get that medication daily. She would have an epileptic episode, and therefore she couldn't probably be cared for. So she was denied for the Peace Corps. But anyway, it's a really cool volunteer organization. The The U.S. support of Israel in Yom Kippur. The Yom Kippur War was a serious damage to the U.S. and USSR relationship. It ended with the Camp David Accords. Camp David is where the presidents, usually it's called their summer house, is, but in 1978, Jimmy Carter essentially helped end the Yom Kippur Wars. And finally, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, what I want you to understand, and if you take a look at that that picture right there, that map, the Soviet garrisons were pretty much all over all over Afghanistan. Now remember, this is part of the domino theory. Look at where the USSR is and look at where Afghanistan is. The idea was that one country in proximity to communist countries would fall to communism. Well, tribal leaders in Afghanistan were very much against having a ruler, having somebody like the USSR in their country. And in order to stop the spread of communism in Afghanistan, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and the United States helped Soviet leaders, resistance fighters in Afghanistan. We supplied them with weapons, we supplied them with tanks, we supplied them with a lot of different weapons. And finally, the Russians left Afghanistan. Now, this is what I want you to read about. What is really sad and ironic is when the United States forces were in Afghanistan. Now, in more recent times, Taliban, Al-Qaeda, Taliban fighters were using old weapons from the Russian invasion that the United States had supplied them on American forces. How ironic that old weapons that Americans had supplied Russian resistance fighters were then being used on American fighters in the 2000s. So read that article for me. That's it for the day. Have a great one. Bye.